Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good morning. I see we are currently at 479, if I'm not mistaken, people who are on the call. And I see the numbers increasing as well. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is well. Feel free to use the chats to just say good morning. How's the weather where you are? Let me just check the chat quickly. Anyone has typed anything? Morning, everyone. I don't see anything on the chat. Does anyone see anything? No, nothing yet, but we'll just give it another minute or two so everyone can join. Now we are at 546, which is very good. Everyone's pretty excited and eager to hear more about the session. Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. We will start at 3 minutes past 10. Just give it one more minute for everyone to join, and then we can start. Those numbers are really increasing quickly. Super exciting. 608. No pressure.
It's just got to do with a good-looking woman on the call.
Let's see. I saw something in the Q&A.
Yeah, it's the chat.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's commenting on the Q&A. I see. Okay. Morning, everyone. Morning. Lisa says the weather in CT is good. Morning, Teresa. Morning to everyone who's joining. Okay, it is 3 minutes past. We will start the session. We have quite an exciting presentation, so we will just start so we can be able to, so Lisa can go through the entire presentation. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to another exciting iTOOsday. Today's iTOOsday is pretty exciting because we have Fia Samuels and Lisa Swain on the call, who are going to be talking about iTOO's brand new launch product called Clinical Trials. It was launched last week, Tuesday, so it's super exciting for us to have this session to know more about this new and exciting product. So we have Fia and Lisa. Fia is the product head of medical malpractice. Fia has been in the insurance industry for more than 20 years and has held various positions across personal, commercial, and specialist liability insurance. Fia's passion is medical malpractice and finding solutions for our clients. The medical malpractice market is niche and personal, and Fia understands that at the heart of all our policies is humanity for practitioners and patients to whom care is provided. Now, Lisa Swain is no stranger to iTOO and has been a partner to us for many years. She is highly regarded and has been at Weber Wenzel since 1997. Her experience is in all aspects of insurance law and dispute resolution. Lisa has represented and advised local and international underwriters, underwriting managers, brokers, and the insured. We are truly grateful to have Lisa with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing more about this new and exciting clinical trials products. So, ladies, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Fia, for letting me join you on this ride. iTOO, as was said, iTOO launched its clinical trials liability insurance last week, and we had a wonderful day last week, Tuesday, Fia and me partnering to tell you all about it. I'm going to give you the background before Fia gets into the nitty-gritty of insurance. And the reason why you need to know the background is because you need to sell this product to your clients. you can only do so if you know the the product, and very importantly, the background to clinical trials, the conduct of clinical trials, how they are approved, how they are regulated, how they are monitored. You have to know all of this information and all the background that I'm going to give to you so that you can ensure that your clients are properly covered. So as iTOO is clever insurance for clever people, you clever people are going to sell this product to your very clever clients. And this product involves clinical trials participated in by other clever people, not the crash test dummies that I have indicated them to be, who participate in clinical trials on an informed basis. So what are clinical trials? Well, clinical trials is really just clinical research, clinical studies, research into new medicines, new medical devices, new procedures. And why do we use human beings? Well, it's the best way to test these new products when they come in into the market. Usually the testing on human beings is subsequent to testing on animals. But it's the way that we learn, it's the way that we try and prevent disease or develop cures for diseases and procedures. And the reason why clinical trials have got so much attention is because they involve interventions that can be invasive on human beings. And so it's very important for us to ensure that clinical trials are conducted in a manner that poses a minimal risk of harm for participants. And it is for this reason that clinical trials are highly regulated. And if you were FIA, you would have lived and breathed clinical trials 24/7 for about the last 6 months. And probably I would go so far as to say that even having done all of that, FIA probably hasn't read everything there is to read about clinical trials. It is unbelievable the amount of literature and regulation around clinical trials. So we're going to try and take you through this very quickly. You will have my slides, you will have access to my slides that you can use to better your knowledge. I'm going to go through it as quickly as I possibly can in the limited time available. So in clinical trials, the three main persons involved are the sponsor or the applicant and the investigator. The investigator is the person who physically conducts the clinical trial at the trial site. This person, the investigator, is in South Africa, must be a South African-based and registered clinician or physician, a medical practitioner, in other words. In some trials, you can have a non-medical practitioner person conducting the trial, like a pharmacist, because you may want to have a pharmacist involved. In that instance, there will be two investigators, the principal investigator being the clinician and the co-investigator being the pharmacist. And the investigator is also responsible for designing the protocol of the clinical trial with the sponsor, if there is a sponsor involved. At every trial site, you need to have an investigator. So the investigators at each site will be the sub-investigators. However, the principal investigator is the main person in charge of the trial and responsible for the trial. And importantly, the guidelines for investigators have been set by the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. You'll hear much about SAPRA, because it is the be all and end all, the top of the pile as far as clinical trials are concerned. What the investigator predominantly does is collates an information package on the trial. It is everything you need to know about the trial. This information is then communicated to the participants in the clinical trials for the purpose of obtaining informed consent. The investigator must continuously report on the progress and the conduct of the trial to the ethical bodies, the ethical committees. What is very important is clinical trials have to be ethically conducted. The protocol must be ethical. The science behind it must be ethical. Everything that is done in a clinical trial must be ethical. And you will see shortly that it's all about ethics. And the ethical committees monitor and review and constantly check on the conduct of clinical trials, as well as the reporting, the final outcome, communication, and conduct after the trials. The sponsor is the person with the money or the entity, the pharmaceutical company, the university, the hospital group. It's the person that is responsible for funding the trial. The sponsor initiates the trial. The sponsor is responsible for getting the trial registered. You do not have to have a sponsor. If you don't have a sponsor, the investigator assumes the sponsor's roles. Some of the main responsibilities of the sponsor are quality management, quality control, trial registration, investigator selection, providing insurance, which is what I will tell you a bit about and Fia will tell you more about, the management of the trial, handling data, making sure that the systems for recording and storing data are absolutely brilliant, so that the confidentiality of the data and the veracity of all the records is maintained throughout the clinical trial and thereafter. You will hear sometimes of an applicant. An applicant is where the sponsor is an international entity or person, and locally the applicant is the person designated to represent the sponsor locally on the ground, and then takes over the sponsor's responsibilities locally. However, if there is an applicant, it doesn't mean that the sponsor's duties that are delegated to the applicant are removed from the sponsor. The sponsor remains responsible for the oversight of the conduct and the monitoring of the trial. So those are the most important people. There are a million other people involved in clinical trial. There are other medical practitioners. There are nurses. There are pharmacists. There are laboratory technicians, laboratory scientists. It's unbelievable how many people are involved. But you don't need to know that about that from me. Otherwise, we'll be here until this afternoon. So importantly, clinical trials, obviously, because they involve interventions that may harm participants or they pose risks to participants, if there are adverse effects that are suffered by participants, these participants are entitled to be compensated. The compensation is no fault compensation. In other words, the participant does not have to prove that any person involved in the clinical trial was at fault for the adverse effect suffered or the injury suffered or even the death suffered by the participant in a clinical trial. One does still have to prove causation. So it's a form of strict liability as opposed to our typical legal liability in our very litigious world, where an aggrieved party must prove both fault and causation before any compensation becomes due and payable. So as I said, clinical trials are highly regulated and the emphasis is on ethics. There are so many committees and councils and regulatory bodies that deal with the ethics of clinical trials. Importantly, in terms of Section 73 of the National Health Act, every institution, health agency, or health establishment at which health research is conducted must either have established a health research ethics committee or must have access to one. And the reason for that is because no clinical trial can be conducted until it has been ethically reviewed. And as I said just now, the ethical review continues throughout the conduct of the trial. The investigator has to report on a regular basis to the ethics committees. And this is to ensure that clinical trials are ethically conducted because they involve deprivation, in a sense, of people's constitutional rights. People have the constitutional right to bodily integrity, to autonomy, not to be treated harmfully, not to be injured without their consent. So ethics is an incredibly important part of a clinical trial. And it is something that you need to know as well. So ethical standards in health research are your typical constitutional rights to life, to health, to safety, to dignity, autonomy, that's informed consent, confidentiality as a research participant, scientific integrity. This essentially involves the benefits being required to outweigh the risks. If the benefits don't outweigh the risks, your clinical trial will not pass first base. Data security is another ethical standard. Governance, as you will see, every body oversees another one. It's, as I said last Tuesday, it's like that movie Casino that I watched a zillion years ago, where everybody watches everybody else. That's exactly what happens in a clinical trial. And the communication of results. The ethical standards in health research come from the Helsinki Declaration. You can go and Google clinical trials and you will see zillions of bodies that are involved in regulating and ethically reviewing clinical trials all around the world and clinical research. So as I said, the top of the pile is the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. It was established in terms of the Medicines and Related Substances Act. What SAHPRA does is it monitors, evaluates, regulates, investigates, inspects, registers, and controls, amongst other things, clinical trials. It provides the legal framework for the review of clinical trials by ethics committees. It ensures that clinical trials are registered on the South African National Clinical Trials Register. You cannot start a clinical trial until it has been registered and has its Department of Health registration number. Before SAHPRA came along and became its big important self, the Medicines Control Council was responsible for regulating clinical trials associated with registered and non-registered medicines. SAHPRA has now assumed that role. National Health Research Ethics Council. This council was established in terms of the National Health Act, and importantly, it sets the guidelines, the norms, and the standards for conducting clinical trials, and it regulates and audits the health research ethics committees. It can refer medical practitioners who may have violated ethical or professional rules to the statutory health professional councils. It can adjudicate complaints about research committees. It can institute disciplinary action against any person found to have violated norms, standards, or guidelines in clinical trials. And it advises the national and provincial departments on ethical issues. Then we have the National Health Research Committee. This is responsible for clinical trials or health research carried out by public health authorities. Public health authorities only conduct health research in relation to priority health problems. And when one wants to try and figure out what is a priority health problem, well, COVID-19 was one of them. What we take into account in determining whether it's a priority health problem, into which research ought to be carried out, one looks at the burden of the disease, cost effectiveness of interventions, the resource implications, and the health needs of our communities. We also have provincial health research committees that feed into the National Health Research Committees, so that the National Health Research Committee always has information on what's on the ground locally, on what's important to it. So importantly are research ethics committees, whether they be national, provincial, they are important bodies which ensure that health research is always conducted ethically and responsibly. So as I said, there are many, many rules, and I'm going to go quickly through this, because if I don't, you're going to die of boredom and you're not going to hear all the important information that FIA has for you on the actual product that you're interested in. So first, we've got the Medicines and Related Substances Act. For you, what's important is Section 21. The Act authorizes SAHPRA to sell for a specific period, specific quantities of unregistered drugs and devices for the purposes of conducting and for the use in clinical trials. And importantly, authorizations can be withdrawn at any time. So if a clinical trial is not being conducted in accordance with an ethically reviewed and approved protocol, SAHPRA can withdraw the authorization to use the unregistered drugs or devices in that clinical trial, and the clinical trial will come to an abrupt end. The other important legislation is the National Health Act. Importantly is Chapter 9, which deals with national health research and information. And this tells us that research or experimentation on living people can only be conducted in a prescribed manner and with the written consent of that person. You will hear of clinical trials performed for therapeutic purposes and for non-therapeutic purposes. Therapeutic just means that we are aiming to treat the disease or the illness. Non-therapeutic, the aim is not to treat the illness or disease. It is generally to monitor how a disease develops. When you probably don't know this, but anybody can participate in a clinical trial, an adult and a child. If a child, a minor, participates in a clinical trial, if the clinical trial is being conducted for therapeutic purposes, the consent of the minor's parent or guardian must be obtained. If the minor is capable of understanding, the minor's consent must be obtained. And minors can only be involved in clinical trials as a participant if there are benefits for the minor, if it's in the minor's interests. You can also conduct non-therapeutic clinical trials with minors as participants, but in this instance, the consent of the Minister of Health must also be obtained. It's important because if the same outcome can be obtained with an adult participating in the clinical trial, then the minor's involvement is not necessary. If the research or the experimentation is unlikely to significantly improve the scientific understanding of a condition, disease, or disorder, then the minor ought not to be participating. If the participation would be contrary to public policy, or if the risk is too high, then the minor will not be permitted to participate in clinical trials or research. The Department of Health has also produced guidelines. The most recent one is the NDOH 2024. Its predecessor was in 2015, and the guidelines are entitled Ethics in Health Research, Principles, Processes, and Structures. Again, it's all around the ethics. So the guidelines, I've given you the link to the guidelines in my slide because they are long, but you need to read them so that you can understand the background to the clinical trials, because all of this information needs to be obtained by you from your clients so that you can provide it to Fia and her team at iTOO so that they can provide quote on adequate insurance for your clients. The guidelines were prepared to ensure that research is conducted in accordance with the highest ethical norms and standards. They provide what South Africa regards as the minimum national benchmark. They provide explanations of the processes for ethical reviews. They provide the standards for research ethics committees and in general, the regulatory framework in South Africa for the conduct of clinical trials. The core ethical principles being respect, scientific merit, and integrity. Once again, the risks must be outweighed by the benefits, and unnecessary clinical trials must not be conducted. Distributive justice, that's the fairness in the way things are distributed. Now, what does that mean? That just means that when one is conducting a clinical trial and advertising out into the public for participation in clinical trials, that must be done fairly with interests of all communities as the center, as the priority. And the last one, the most important one, is an obligation to always act in the interests of and for the benefit of the patient. We have a very important document published by the Department of Health. That's the South African Good Clinical Practice Clinical Trial Guidelines. They were prepared in 2020 in collaboration with the Department of Health, of course, SAPRA, and the National Health Research Ethics Council. Again, I've given you the link to the guidelines. Read them. They are important. They are probably the most important document for as far as clinical trials are concerned in South Africa. And what the guidelines deal with are the key concepts in clinical trials being the ethical principles, the justification for the trial, the risks, the burdens, the benefits, the rights and safety of participants, informed consent, ethics review, trial incentives and participant compensation, scientific requirements for research protocols, and the management and dissemination of data and the results of the research. Compliance with the guidelines is mandatory, which is why you need to know what the guidelines deal with and what they say. And the reason why it's mandatory is because we need to ensure that the safety and interests of the public, the participants, are maintained at all times. There are all sorts of other guidelines. I have mentioned but a few. So let me get on to the important part. Informed consent. Cannot conduct a clinical trial unless you have obtained informed consent from the participants. Participation is voluntary. A participant cannot be coerced into participating. Yes, they are paid, but they are only paid for their time and for their travel costs. They are not paid zillions of rands to participate in clinical trials. Why do we need to be informed? Well, because the participation in a clinical trial involves potential risk. So you cannot voluntarily participate if you don't know what you're participating in. I have set out in my slides the important parts of what constitutes informed consent. Importantly, participants must understand what they are being asked to consent to. They must have time to consider it. They must sign it. How do you get informed consent? Well, a participant needs to know all about the trial, what it involves, why it's being conducted, why am I being approached as a participant. I must be told that my participation is voluntary. I must be told that the trial will be ethically reviewed. I need to be told what the foreseeable risks are, what could happen to me, what the benefits are, etc. I must also be told that my participation in the trial is maintained confidential, and my records, aside from being accessible to the ethical committees and bodies that regulate the conduct of the trial and the persons involved in the conduct of the trial, my medical information and records will be kept confidential. I must be informed about no-fault compensation, so that if I suffer an adverse effect as a result of my participation in the trial, I will be compensated and I will not need to prove fault on the part of anybody involved in the trial. Importantly, you're not compensated just because you had an adverse effect. You are only compensated for effects or injuries that are severe, that are not venial, that are incapable of quickly being cured. You're not compensated for discomfort. But very importantly, you're only compensated where your injury or adverse effect is directly as a result of your participation in the trial. I've said it before, I'll say it again. The information, the health information, the records involved in a clinical trial, patient information must be kept confidential. It is absolutely vital. And for this reason, both the investigator and the sponsors have responsibility to ensure that their systems are capable of maintaining the confidentiality of records. I'm going to quickly deal with insurance. Insurance in clinical trials is mandatory. Fia will tell you about the mandatory clinical trial liability insurance. I'm going to tell you that when you're dealing with a client who wants to conduct or sponsor a clinical trial, malpractice insurance and cyber risk liability insurance are also absolutely vital. Why? Because a clinical trial liability insurance policy will only provide a certain amount of cover. It does not cover an investigator who was negligent, who then causes harm to a participant as a result of negligence. It does not cover the medical professionals involved for their negligence in their conduct of clinical trials. Cyber risk liability insurance, if the data that needs to be so importantly protected is at risk or is leaked out, if the confidentiality is lost, cyber risk liability insurance is absolutely vital for your clients. And that's aside from all sorts of other insurance that you can talk your way into in discussions around clinical trials. Claims procedures. Clinical trial claims go through the applicants or the sponsors. If there's no sponsor or applicant, then to the investigator. But claims generally go through the investigator. So if there is a claim for an adverse effect or an injury arising out of a participant's participation in the clinical trial, that claim must be directed to the investigator, who will then direct it to the sponsor and applicant, who are responsible for compensating the participant. If there is a dispute as to the amount of compensation that ought to be paid, these disputes are generally referred to arbitration. So there should ideally be an arbitration clause in the agreement concluded with a participant before the clinical trial begins. I have included a number of cases that have involved clinical trials. I will not go through them due to time limitations. What you do need to know is that most of the litigation in clinical trials has been around ethics, has been around failure to obtain proper informed consent. They have involved deviation from protocols. They have involved failure to properly report the studies, and so on and so on. We do not see a lot of litigation on the compensation for injuries, death, or the adverse effects arising out of clinical trials. And the reason for that is because your no-fault compensation generally takes care of it, and that is then covered by your clinical trial liability insurance. And on that note, over to Fia.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you always for the opportunity to discuss with our colleagues and our partners. We are truly blessed to have you as part of our team that can assist us. I'm going to unpack clinical trials more from an insurance-related point of view. And we've been in clinical trials since 2016. Our broker partners had given us feedback, and one of the challenges had been is that we were not able to, at the time, provide cover for all types of clinical trials. We went back to the drawing board, and the opportunity then has taken us 6 months, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, lots and lots of reading, and lots of research. We can date back to the first trial taking place in 1997. We also know there's distinguishing factors specifically in South Africa that makes clinical trials attractive to sponsors from foreign countries. We have over 60 million individuals that live in our country from diverse patient population groups. We also have never had individuals that even received treatment for their diseases or that were not aware that there could be clinical trials. We also know that it's much cheaper and the lower cost to do clinical trials in South Africa makes it very attractive. We also need to consider that South Africa has a very strong ethnic, racial, and diverse nation with very different languages. As Lisa touched on, informed consent is a major issue. And we note that patient-related materials have to be translated into the native languages of the patients. In South Africa, life science translation is not a simple issue. There is no language in certain languages where there's a local word for randomization or placebo. And this is a challenge that has to be taken into account, specifically in terms of clinical trials. We also know, like Lisa touched on, regulatory approval and ethics review is one of the strongest in Africa. And that's why South Africa is the hub for clinical trials. We know the issue of informed consent will always be an ethical issue, not just in medical malpractice, but in clinical trials as well. Furthermore, we need to consider the political and socioeconomic factors that are within our country. We are considered a middle-income country with severe economic disparities, It is said that 50% of South African individuals live below the poverty line. So when a sponsor or a clinical research organization has to undertake a clinical trial, we need to ensure that past prejudices do not interfere with the current studies in terms of this. We also know that illiteracy is very high in Africa and in South Africa, and one of the key factors that a lot of sponsors and clinical research organizations are undertaking is called a New Speaking book. This book has been developed that will take a protocol and the consent, and it will actually put it into a manner in which the individual can listen to and therefore give consent. Again, consent is paramount in undertaking a clinical trial, and it has to be voluntary in terms of the participant. We know that obviously clinical trials has been designed to answer specific questions about a drug, a disease, or a procedure. These specific questions are better found in preventing, detecting, and treating any condition. Clinical trials are conducted after laboratory tests are undertaken on animals and generally a patient zero. After these final steps are undertaken, this is where it becomes a new drug development process. If we were then to think about what clinical trials can study, it studies new drugs or a combination of drugs, new ways to use existing treatments, new medical devices, new ways to change behavior, and new ways to improve the quality of life with individuals with acute illnesses or chronic illnesses. And we know in the lifestyles that we have, many individuals are now prone to more TB. HIV is paramount in your young individuals, as well as diabetes. So clinical trials can help study these key factors. And we know obesity is a #1 issue as well. We can, and I will share my slides with you, but just to confirm, there are 4 key types of clinical trials. A single arm prospective study means everyone's enrolled in a trial is treated the same way. Randomized control trials gives a comparison of a treatment group. One part of a group would receive a placebo drug and the other group would receive the actual drug. And you'd have to participate to see how and which group does better. The blind trial is a randomized control trial with the treatment and placebo groups not knowing what they have received in terms of a drug. And this is also known as the phenomenon where somebody that might have taken the placebo, meaning that there's nothing actually in it, might feel better than the individual that actually took the correct drug being on trial. The double-blind trial is a treatment and a placebo group where both the participants, the doctors, and the nurses are not aware of what they are receiving in terms of the clinical trial. This is to ensure that there's no unconscious bias on part of the clinicians when they're conducting the trial and reporting on the results. We know the gold standard in clinical trials is the double-blind randomized control trial because of its objectivity and most scientific way to determine the safety standards. We also know, like Lisa has touched on, there are key players. SAHPRA will always be part of #1 in approving the clinical trial, the sponsor who's generally sponsoring the trial, the clinical research organization that runs the trial in conjunction with the principal investigator, the sub-investigator, and the study coordinator. As Lisa touched on, there are other medical professionals from pharmacists on the trial to lab techs. We forget there's nursing professionals that work on a clinical trial as well. And last but not least is the participant. Clinical trials will provide no fault compensation for the participant's bodily injury or harm in those instances. We also know there are different phases of clinical trials. If you were to consider that most of the trials in South Africa are phase 1 through to phase 4 clinical trials, if you were to summarize a phase 1 clinical trial, it's the safety portion of a clinical trial, and generally the participants that are involved in a phase 1 clinical trial is generally less than 100 individuals. Phase 2 of a clinical trial is more the efficacy part of a trial. This is where you're doing investigation to see whether or not a drug or device will alleviate pain, how safe it is, and what is the most effective dosage in this instance. Your trial size is generally more between 100 and 300 participants on this. Phase 3 is the confirmation stage, and your sample size of number of participants here can range anything from 300 to 3,000 participants. Here you confirm under phase 3 whether the drug has been less effective, whether there's long-term adverse effects, what is the quality of your life, and what is the survival if you are participating and taking this drug in terms of the future, and how does it affect existing treatments. Phase 4 is the follow-up stage. So generally you have to go phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and finally phase 4 is where the drug is approved and the investigation has been done. There are several thousand individuals that would participate on the final phase. And the questions that are asked in the final phase 4 that the principal investigator and the team would have to answer: is the drug more safe and efficacy in relation to other drugs in the market? What are the long-term benefits and what are the long-term risks in terms of the phase that it has been and for the trial itself? We know that a lot of regulation and insurance requirements is on the sponsor as well as the individual or organization that undertakes a clinical trial. Both myself and Lisa will be sharing our slides. We do not want to have you fall asleep on a Tuesday afternoon, but we do know that at the end of the day, all clinical trials is about the ethics and the quality being the credible data behind the clinical trial. We also know the Declaration of Helsinki, which we have unpacked, talks about the safety of the participant and outweighing the benefits and the risks. And this is important to manage vulnerable groups and informed consent, privacy and confidentiality, and post-trial access to treatment. We also know that the data cannot lie. So therefore, misconduct, fabrication, and falsification of clinical data is not part of cover for clinical trials. However, if research misconduct happens, but it doesn't include an error, that would be covered under clinical trial policy. We know the guidelines are very credible and important, and it's not only in South Africa, but these guidelines are worldwide, and it has international ethical and scientific quality standards for designing, conducting, and reporting. And these are all for human participation. The guidelines has been updated. So if you are looking at guidelines, which is the 2nd edition, please note 3rd edition is around, and we'll share that with you as well. Again, governed by SAPRA, and these guidelines are mandatory. These guidelines have to be complied with in terms of clinical trials. The guidelines are very clear that you have to hold insurance, and this is where we as iTOO can provide that cover. When the insurance certificate is issued to a clinical research organization, they have to make sure that the certificate provided to SAPRA includes the title and protocol of the clinical trial, the name and local address of the insurance company that has provided the cover for the clinical trial, the liability limit, the date of validity, the date of commencement and termination, and it has to be signed electronically by the insurer. Gone are the days where we do handwritten signed documents, so electronic signatures are accepted. Any special conditions or exclusions would have to reflect on the certificate that is being issued to the sponsor or the clinical research organization. And it has to be insured and issued under the South African Insurance Act law. There are further guidelines in the good clinical guidelines, and we would take a lot more time if we had to unpack all of these, but we will share that, as I said. Now, with you, our brokers, we would like to take a stance and protect the path to progress. We have taken a lot into context, and we want to introduce you to our comprehensive coverage for clinical trials. What sets us apart is that we have listened and we've done our research, and our cover is afforded up to 50 million in capacity, depending on the nature of the trial and the perceived risk. What we do offer is an automatic aggregate reinstatement in addition to your normal limit of indemnity. We do know that cover is needed for breach of confidentiality in the sharing of information on participants, and this is paramount in line with POPI regulations. We also provide cover for documentation that is available, and this is part of the offering and automatically included in our cover. We as iTOO can tailor our cover to meet the specific needs of the different clinical trials, including perhaps different sublimits or an alternative deductible section for the client. We also know that with every policy, there are key exclusions. We do not cover any departure or failure from the complying with the protocol, any known risk or intentional misconduct, any genetic manipulation or engineering, standard war and terrorism clauses apply, regulatory non-compliance, and when the research subject, this is the participant, acting deliberately or contrary to the protocol for which they signed to, that is not covered by the policy. Where the trial hasn't been granted ethical approval or does not comply with the regulations. And Lisa set this out very clearly. Ethical approval, the Department of Health, these are the regulations that a clinical trial has to comply with. Failure to comply with this does not provide indemnity under a clinical trial policy. We also know that our policy is a claims-made policy and that it's a one policy per trial. The premium is payable annually, and at renewal, if it is a multi-year trial, it is simply a no claims declaration is required. The limit of indemnity is stressed across the entire clinical trial, and we have the ability offering an extended reporting period. The limit of indemnity generally is sublimited per volunteer, and this is a requirement of SAHPRA. It is often sublimited to 10% of the limit of indemnity, and therefore, when you purchase, for example, a 10 million rand limit, your participants' limit would be sublimited to 1 million. If you're purchasing 1 million rand, it would be sublimited to 100,000. We do ask our brokers, when you send your request through to us, is to clearly state the limit of indemnity that you would require purchasing for the clinical trial, as long as the information is there, so that we can provide you with the relative quotes that you require. Now, our underwriting team does consider the following when they take into account clinical trials: whether the client has approved or will be applying for approval from SAHPRA for the clinical trial. We'd also look at the experience of the clinical research organization, the experience of the principal investigator, the phase of the trial, the number of volunteers or participants, the limit of indemnity, and the period of clinical trials. You'll find that some clinical trials are for 6 months and some clinical trials are for 6 years. We have to consider that when we take into account underwriting. A lot of the information that an underwriting team does require is often in the protocol, as well as the informed consent, which the principal investigator and the team would be putting together. We would require, as I said, a documentation would be a completed, signed and dated proposal form, as well as the approval of the study. The protocol is about 350 pages long. We go through this to understand the drug, we understand the number of sites, we understand the information that is required, and what is the trial trying to prove. Research subjects information. Your proposal form will tell you that you have research subjects that are based in different sites, different age groups. This helps in understanding and underwriting our processes. The hold harmless indemnification is generally required at claim stage. As an individual, you sign the consent. We would need proof that the individual was in the clinical trial, they participated, as well as the consent form at the claim stage. We do know clinical trials will be based on the research that is being undertaken, the severity, the number of research subjects, as well as the period of cover. You'll find that we understand that not every trial is the same. Providing us with all the information up front allows us and the underwriting team the ability to underwrite the clinical trial. The proposal form, as well as our playbook, will be shared with all of you, as well as the slides. That takes me to 5 minutes before we're about to end, and I'd like to open to any questions or any comments that you have, that in order to assist you in managing and undertaking clinical trials with your clients. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pia. Thank you so much, Lisa, for an amazing, informative presentation. We do have a question from Lesego. who says, in respect of the adverse effects claim, you mentioned that the cover does not respond to minor effects. Could you kindly revisit what the threshold or test is that is applied to determine what is minor versus what is major?
That would be under Lisa, the regulations. Lisa, do you want to come online as well?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I said minor, I suppose, really just to due to the time limits. What you are not entitled to be compensated for is is minor discomfort, or let's say the drug that is being tested gives you headaches for a month. You're not going to get compensated for that. It is more serious injuries, more debilitating injuries or effects, adverse effects, for which you are entitled to compensation. You're also not entitled to compensation for a result that is foreseeable and in respect of which you as participant were informed and warned about. So, you're also not going to be compensated if you deviate from the protocol. So, for instance, I had a claim years ago involving a TB clinical trial, and the participant was supposed to take the TB medication, 3 times a day, every day for 2 months. That person didn't, suffered adverse effects. You're not going to receive any compensation for that. It's not really, no, the legislation does not say what constitutes serious and what doesn't. One needs to take the facts into account. One needs to take the purpose of the trial, the drug or the device being tested, the risks that were told to the participant, the foreseeable risks, whether or not you're in a position of discomfort, whether how curable it is, how debilitating it is. And of course, that differs from one trial to another.
Correct. And I think, Lisa, if you look at the consent form that a participant completes, it will give you what are adverse side effects, what are minor side effects, what is discomfort. And when you consent, you get told upfront, you might have nausea, you might have a headache, but you might also die. So they've given you very much. So when you comply, those are what part of the clinical trial would be.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And we'll take one more question. The question is from an anonymous user who says, does the policy cover the aftercare period as well?
So your clinical trial generally has a period in which they would have a timeline, and that's where the extended reporting period comes in. But for example, if you have a patient that is on a clinical trial for TB, and the patient is part of an existing program for their health, their aftercare would still be under the clinician's care in conjunction with the clinical trial. So your care doesn't stop. And I think what's important to understand, some diseases will continue post-trial. And it's important that the participant continues with their ongoing health care via the health organization that is rendering their care. It doesn't mean that the clinical trial's over, that there's no health care that's supposed to be provided to those individuals.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, ladies, once again for an informative presentation. Thank you to everyone who joined the call. If you happen to join the call late and you missed most of the presentation, do not worry. The recordings are uploaded onto our iTOO YouTube channel, so you can just pop over there to give yourself a refresher. Thank you so much. We will see everyone next week, same time, same place on another iTOOsday. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Fia.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
Ciao.